In the quiet town of Eldridge, where the wind whispered secrets through the tall oak trees and shadows danced under the pale moonlight, young Clara was rummaging through her grandmother's attic. The attic was a magical, dusty place, almost like stepping into a treasure chest filled with forgotten wonders. Clara loved going up there. It was her favorite spot in her grandmother's cozy old house. The wooden floor creaked softly under her small feet, and the beams of sunlight that streamed in through the tiny window made the dust particles flicker, like little stars trapped in a box. The air was thick with the musty smell of old wood, faded paint, and rusted metal. Clara wrinkled her nose at the smell. It was strange but somehow comforting. It reminded her of the many stories her grandmother had told her about the past, stories that felt as old as time itself. Clara was determined to find something interesting among the relics of her family's past. She fancied herself a treasure hunter, and her heart raced with excitement as she sifted through boxes covered in dust and labeled with faded names that seemed to be calling out to her. She pushed aside an old blanket and climbed over a heap of forgotten toys, her eyes glimmering with anticipation. There were so many boxes, each containing memories from years gone by. Some were filled with old books with tattered covers, while others held yellowed photographs of people smiling joyfully, their faces frozen in time. Clara wanted to explore every inch of this hidden world but kept pushing ahead, eager to uncover something truly special. Suddenly, Clara's fingers brushed against something smooth and cold. Startled, she pulled her hand back for a moment, but curiosity quickly took over. It was a doll, beautifully crafted yet undeniably eerie. The doll's porcelain face was pale, and the once rosy cheeks that had been painted with care were now tarnished and cracked with age. Clara picked it up, her heart still racing, and examined its delicate features. It was intricately designed, wearing a vintage dress that seemed straight out of another time, its fabric soft and faded, full of stories of its own. But as Clara turned the doll around, a shiver ran down her spine. To her horror, she noticed something unsettling. The doll had no eyes. Instead of bright shiny orbs, there were only empty sockets that seemed to gaze into her very soul. Clara felt a chill envelop her, wrapping around her like a shadow. Even though she felt a pang of fear, she couldn't resist the strange magnetism of the doll. She found herself inexplicably drawn to it, as if it were calling her name. With the doll tucked under her arm, she hurried down the creaky attic stairs, the old wood groaning beneath her as if warning her of what lay ahead. Despite her unease, Clara couldn't help but keep stealing glances at the doll. The hollow gaze of its empty eye sockets sent a wave of goosebumps over her skin, but she pushed through, convincing herself that it was simply a creation made of porcelain and paint, a lifeless object with no power. Once inside her room, Clara placed the doll on her desk, feeling its presence loom over her like a dark cloud. The sunlight streaming through her window illuminated the dust dancing around the doll, creating an almost magical glow. That night, Clara pulled the covers tightly around her as she closed her eyes, hoping to shut out the unease lingering in the corner of her mind. She wanted to forget about the strange doll, but it felt impossible. As Clara lay in bed, she couldn't help but gaze at the doll. The flickering light from her bedside lamp cast jagged shadows across the wall, making the doll seem even more grotesque and alive. A whisper of wind rattled the window, echoing like ghostly laughter in her ears, and Clara imagined she could hear something, a soft, guttural sound coming from the doll that chilled her to the bone. She shook her head as if trying to physically rid herself of the image. It was just a doll, after all, crafted from porcelain and painted with care. Yet, as darkness enveloped her room, the feeling of being watched seeped deeper into her thoughts. The next morning, Clara awoke to beams of warm sunlight pouring through the window. Rubbing her eyes sleepily, she turned over, only to notice something strange. The doll had moved. It was no longer perched on her desk. Now, it was sitting on her bed, its cold, porcelain hands resting upon her blanket with a menacing calmness. Clara's heart thundered in her chest. Had she moved it in her sleep? The thought seemed unlikely. She quickly dismissed the unsettling idea, blaming it all on her imagination, stubbornly reminding herself that dolls couldn't move on their own. Days passed, and life in Eldridge went on. Clara played with her friends at the park, helped her grandmother tend to the colorful flowers in the garden, and attended her small school a few blocks away. Each day felt familiar and cozy, like the hugs from her grandmother, yet each night brought back that unsettling feeling. Every time she glanced at the doll before sleep, It felt as if the empty sockets were somehow taunting her, teasing her with its stillness and silence. As the nights wore on, Clara started to feel more and more exhausted. Whispers in the night crept into her dreams, turning into dark clouds that filled her mind with shadowy figures that danced and beckoned. She tossed and turned, unable to escape their grip on her thoughts. Clara thought about pushing the doll away, keeping it out of her sight, hoping that would ease her troubled mind. However, her loving grandmother intervened, insisting that the doll was a treasured family heirloom, something important that needed to stay in the family. Reluctantly, Clara accepted the doll's presence in her room once more. She placed it back on her desk, turned away, and tried to forget it existed. But it was as if the doll had taken on a malevolence of its own, haunting her more intensely each night. The fifth night, however, was different. Clara awoke with a start, drenched in cold sweat. The room was cloaked in darkness, the moon barely peeking through the curtains, creating strange shapes that danced upon her walls. Her heart pounded loudly in her ears as she turned in her bed to find the doll mere inches from her face, its hollow gaze fixed directly on her own. Panic surged through Clara, her chest tight with fear, and she scrambled back, tripping over her blankets, feeling like a small mouse caught in a trap. Clara's breath quickened, coming in rapid gasps as she tried to process what she was seeing. The weight of something unspeakable thickened the air around her, suffocating her. Something was profoundly wrong, and she could feel it gnawing at her mind, wrapping around her thoughts, and whispering dark things in her ears. In that moment, she understood that her only choice was to stop this madness once and for all. As dawn broke, Clara sat on the edge of her bed, her resolve crumbling like an old, dry cookie. She felt lost and confused, unsure of what to do with the doll that now felt deeply chained to her heart. She could not shake the unsettling feeling that the doll wasn't just a forgotten toy of her family but something much more sinister. Gathering all her courage, Clara stormed down the stairs, determined to banish the nightmare that had taken root in her life. However, as she stepped into the bright kitchen, filled with the comforting aroma of breakfast being cooked by her grandmother, Clara felt a strange compulsion to keep the doll in her life. To her surprise, the thought was overwhelming, blooming within her mind like a grotesque flower sprouting through the cracks of her sanity. It was as if the doll had woven itself into the fabric of her existence, and the more she fought against it, the deeper the connection seemed to grow. Clara placed the doll back on her desk in a moment of hesitation, convinced it was merely her imagination getting the best of her. But deep down, she knew the unholy bond had formed. Her nights were now tethered to the sinister reality of that forsaken porcelain figure. Each night, Clara lay awake, fearful and uncertain about what the next day would bring. She began to imagine all sorts of dark stories about the doll, creating wild tales in her mind that sent her heart racing. Was the doll truly a family heirloom, or was it hiding something far more sinister? Clara had no idea, but deep down, she was going to find out just how deeply it had taken root in her psyche. As she closed her eyes that night, she had a sinking feeling that the mystery surrounding the doll was only just beginning. Little did she know that it would lead her on an adventure filled with secrets, courage, and the strength to face the shadows that lurked within. The echoes of laughter, the comforting sounds of her grandmother's presence, and the familiarity of Eldridge surrounded her as she wrestled with her imagination. But somewhere beneath the layers of fear, there was also a spark of courage, a desire to uncover the truth about the doll and what lay behind those hollow eyes. Clara was ready for a journey that would change her life forever, and she could feel it stirring deep within her. What secrets lay beneath the carved surface of that doll? What mysteries awaited Clara in the dark corners of her own heart? The pages of her own story were yet to be written, and she would soon learn that the deepest bonds are often forged not from fear, but from the courage to face what lies ahead. And thus, Clara's journey began, beneath the watchful gaze of a doll that seemed to hold the keys to a forgotten past. In the days that followed, Clara could no longer ignore the creeping dread filling her heart each night. Shadows in her room had grown longer, darker, as the doll moved ever closer to her bed. Its icy fingers seemed to reach out, beckoning her in a way that made her skin prickle with unease. The porcelain doll, with its eyeless face, had become a dreadful part of her life. Each morning, Clara woke to the sight of it sitting on her dresser, and a chill unfurled inside her. It was both agonizingly familiar and terrifyingly strange. Her friends began to notice the change in her demeanor, the way her laughter faded into a somber silence. They would ask about her day, but Clara often felt too weighed down to respond with joy. Her evening visits to the playground turned into silent walks home, her heart heavy with the tales of fear she now carried. It felt like the doll had seeped into every corner of her world, casting a shadow over even the sunniest of days. One afternoon, Clara's best friend, Lucy, came over to play. The air was thick with anticipation, but Clara felt her stomach twist with anxiety instead. It was hard to focus on the games they always loved to play. All she could think about was the doll and the way it seemed to shift in its place whenever she looked away. Finally, in a moment of desperation, Clara confided in Lucy, her voice trembling as she spoke. I think the doll is moving at night," she admitted, glancing at the corner where the doll usually sat. "You're joking, right?" Lucy replied, raising an eyebrow, trying hard to sound brave. "It's just a doll. You're making it sound like something out of a horror movie." Clara wanted to believe her friend, but the fear rooted deep within her only tightened its grip, squeezing like a vice. That night, Clara's nightmares came back, more dreadful than ever before. It was as if something beyond itself was trying to crawl into her mind. She tossed and turned, sweat soaking her sheets, as the weight of the doll's presence pressed down upon her chest like a heavy stone. Clara could sense the dark energy swirling around her, wrapping her in shivering tendrils. When Clara finally awoke, a wave of panic washed over her. The doll was missing from its usual spot. Her heart raced as she surged out of bed, searching frantically under her bed and behind her bookshelves. Where could it be? The absence of the doll felt monumental, like a huge earthquake shaking her fragile sense of safety. Fear clawed at her throat as she whispered out loud, calling for the doll as if it could hear her. "Please come back," she murmured, half hoping it would return and half dreading what that return might mean. After what felt like hours of searching, Clara crossed towards her bedroom door, her mind spinning with worry and dread. She opened the door slowly, and there was the doll, propped against her bedroom door, as if it were waiting to welcome her home. Its eyeless face was turned slightly, as though it had been listening to her thoughts. Sweat trickled down Clara's back, and she recoiled, her heart racing in her chest. The doll looked even more sinister than before, demanding her attention with a gaze that felt like icy fingers curling around her heart. Desperate for a break, Clara sought solace in her enchanted garden. The garden was usually her favorite place, filled with vibrant flowers that danced in the gentle breeze, their sweet scents lifting her spirits. But even among the colorful petals, the memories of fear clung to her like the dampness of an unyielding fog. In the garden, she could almost hear the soft whispers of the doll echoing in her mind, as if its voice wove into her thoughts like a dark thread knitting her fears closely. Each flower seemed to lean away from her, making her feel more isolated and helpless. That evening, seeking comfort and answers, Clara sat with her grandmother, who always seemed to know just how to ease her troubled mind. With soft fingers, her grandmother knitted quietly as if the world outside had stopped turning. Clara gulped a breath of uncertainty, then recounted her terrifying experiences with the doll. Her voice quivered like a fragile leaf in the wind as she spoke. Her grandmother listened intently, nodding in understanding. But when Clara mentioned how the doll seemed to move, her grandmother's calm demeanor shifted. Concern etched itself into her features, and her voice took on a more serious tone. "You must treat that doll with caution, Clara," she said, her words layered with an ominous weight. "It's more than just a toy, it's a remnant of a darker past. It could bring with it some unsettling energy. You're going to have to confront what lies within." Clara's heart felt heavy as her grandmother's words sunk in, sending a shiver racing down her spine. That night, Clara prepared herself for yet another restless slumber, haunted by her thoughts. She laid in bed with her blankets tightly wrapped around her, like a cocoon trying to shield her from the world. But no matter how hard she tried, she could feel the doll drawing near. And then came the silence, a thick, suffocating stillness that filled the room, the air growing heavy with foreboding. Panic clawed at her heart as guttural whispers seeped into the corners of the room. In a matter of moments, she was jolted awake, eyes wide and heart pounding. There it was, the doll, perched on her bedside table, much closer than it had ever been. With its eyeless face staring back at her, it seemed to mock her fright. Clara's breath came in quick gasps, her mind racing with fear and confusion. What did this all mean? Something ancient and fearsome lay within the doll, an energy that pulsed like a living thing, alive and aware of Clara's terror. But then a thought struck her. What if the doll wasn't supposed to be frightening? What if there was more to it than she understood? This thought briefly mingled with her dread, forming an uneasy bond. Resolving to ignore the lingering fear, Clara pulled the blankets over her head, hoping to escape the nightmare that had invaded her life. Yet, the comfortable blackness of the night turned into a living nightmare that entwined itself with her frantic dreams, wrapping around her like a cloying vine, squeezing the very breath from her lungs. She could hear the whispers clearer now, mingling with her deepest thoughts and fears. Each whisper carried a message, unintelligible yet filled with a sinister promise that left her shivering. As days turned into weeks, Clara felt herself succumbing to an overwhelming darkness. The doll had transformed into a sinister sentinel, its empty sockets always following her. Shadows in corners grew darker, stretching like claws ready to grab hold of her. The walls seemed to whisper her name in a language she couldn't understand, warping and twisting her reality into something more sinister. The people she once adored faded into the background of her life, their laughter and play a distant memory. Clara felt herself becoming a shadow of the girl she used to be, the once lively child now merely a specter drifting through her own existence. She spent her afternoons in silence, hiding in corners of her room, too haunted to bear reminders of the beauty outside. Days quickly passed into weeks, but the only friend Clara felt at that moment was the doll. Strangely, it became a twisted sort of company. The more it revealed itself, the quicker her existing friendships wilted. With every shift of its porcelain body, something darker enveloped Clara, squeezing out the colors of her past until all she saw were grays and blacks. During a particularly quiet afternoon, Clara ventured out to the enchanted garden once more, hoping to find solace among the flowers that had grown duller too. The once bright flowers drooped, their colors muted as if somehow reflecting Clara's growing sadness. The air felt thick, suffused with a feeling of despair that tugged at her very being. To her surprise, one flower, a delicate bluebell, was still vibrant, standing tall against the gloom that surrounded it. As Clara knelt by it, the flower seemed to dance gently in the breeze, its petals shimmering like small drops of hopeful light. Clara reached out, fingers brushing against its tender petals, and for a moment, everything felt possible again. But just as the bud began to bloom in her heart, the whispers from the doll flooded back. It was like a shadow creeping into her mind, tugging at her heartstrings, pulling her back into darkness. The chill swept over her, and she pressed her hands to her ears, wishing for the whispers to vanish. In that instant, Clara realized she could not continue like this. She needed to confront the doll, not with fear, but with determination. She could not allow it to steal her joy any longer. She stood up, wiping the tears from her cheeks, feeling the gentle breeze lift her spirit just a little. That night, with resolve firm in her heart, Clara climbed into bed, locking her gaze on the doll, which sat silently on her bedside table, ominous and still. "You don't scare me," she declared, her voice steady. The doll remained silent, its eyeless face still turned toward her. But Clara could sense something changing in the air. The whispers subsided, as if they were waiting for her next move, holding their breath in anticipation. With renewed strength, Clara narrowed her eyes and leaned closer. "What is it that you want from me?" she asked. The room fell silent, time itself seeming to pause. The doll, with its porcelain skin gleaming eerily in the moonlight, appeared to listen. Each passing minute felt like an eternity, but Clara held her ground. She could feel a connection building, something beyond the fear, a deep, unexpected understanding. As dawn crept into her room and the first rays of light illuminated the shadows, Clara took a deep breath, feeling strong and ready to face whatever challenge lay ahead. It was time to confront the ominous presence that lingered in her life, to unravel the mystery of the doll and reclaim the joy that belonged to her. She could feel it in her bones. The journey was only just beginning. One eerie evening, a storm rumbled through Eldridge, shaking the small town like a giant's roar. The wind howled, and the rain lashed at the window panes, while lightning split the sky open, illuminating the twisting branches outside like jagged teeth. Inside, Clara's heart was pounding wildly. Her fears had transformed into a steady buzz of desperation that filled the air around her, turning the quiet of her room into a battleground. Clara sat in her darkened room, her little hands wrapped tightly around the edge of the bed. She could hear the muffled sounds of her parents talking and laughing downstairs, completely unaware of the terror that had gripped their daughter. But for Clara, it felt as though her world was spiraling into shadows each night. She longed for sleep but found it elusive, replaced instead by the unsettling presence of the eyeless doll that sat motionless in the corner of her room. It stared at her with its empty gaze, a constant reminder of everything that frightened her. Despite the chaos of her emotions, Clara resolved to confront her fears. With determination bubbling inside her, she placed the doll in the center of her room. It felt heavy in her hands, a harbinger of all her worries and anxieties. The room was dim, with just a flicker of light from the storm outside, casting strange shapes on the walls. "You have no power over me," she whispered to the doll, each word trembling in her voice yet steady in her intent. She wanted to believe her own words, to banish the haunting shadows from her mind. But instead of fear, the doll seemed to convey an unsettling silence, as if it understood her challenge and was biding its time. Clara felt a shiver run down her spine and pulled the blanket around her shoulders tightly. The days turned to nights, and nights to days, but the storm outside matched the chaos brewing within Clara. The thunder roared, rattling her windows, and the rain lashed against the glass like 1,000 tiny fingers trying to get in. Every time she attempted to fall asleep, she could hear those guttural whispers, dark and menacing, echoing just beyond her consciousness. Clara's nerves frayed, turning her laughter into hollow stares and distant memories. She no longer found joy in playing with her friends or even reading her favorite stories. The once familiar words seemed to float away, like butterflies leading her into a painful darkness. One fateful night, as thunder cracked like a whip and rain beat against the windows with relentless fury, Clara awoke suddenly. The room was cloaked in an ominous darkness that felt alive, and Clara trembled under the weight of the suffocating silence enveloping her. Her heart raced and thudded painfully in her chest. She blinked, trying to adjust her eyes to the gloom, when she felt an unsettling pressure on her chest. The doll was there. This time, it loomed above her, its form casting a twisted shadow that danced on the wall like a dark specter. As Clara stared at the doll, clarity rushed over her like icy water. She understood, it was feeding off her fears. She had become a mere shadow of her former self, and the doll, her silent tormentor, thrived in her despair. Clara felt trapped, unable to differentiate between reality and the swirling nightmare her mind had conjured. The whispers beckoned to her, promising clarity and understanding, inviting her to join them in their dark and sinister realm. Her sanity cracked like glass under pressure, and before she knew it, Clara found herself repeating the eerie words of the chant, her voice growing stronger with each echo. The sounds reverberated through her mind, pulling her deeper into its madness. Each whisper felt like a jagged knife, slicing her very essence with despair. Time became meaningless as she spiraled down into the abyss, abandoning all hope. One day, when the sky was overcast with clouds that mirrored Clara's own dark thoughts, her grandmother entered her room. She looked concerned, and the lines of worry etched deeply across her aged face told Clara that something profound had shifted. Clara's once bright eyes had dulled, looking as empty as the doll's. "You need to let the doll go," her grandmother urged gently, her voice trembling as if she could hardly bear to speak. There was a depth of fear behind her eyes, a worry that Clara could see and feel. But Clara couldn't let it go. The doll had become entwined with her very being, an inseparable part of her life. As the days pressed forward like a relentless wave, she slipped further into despair. She abandoned her friends and the warmth of sunlight, replacing them with the chilling comfort of the doll. It was as if the doll understood her pain, embodying her fears and insecurities, and Clara clung to it, finding solace in the very source of her torment. One stormy evening, Clara finally succumbed to the overwhelming weight of her emotions. She cradled the doll against her chest, holding it tightly like a lifeline. Tears streamed down her face, the salty drops pooled on the floor, each one a fragment of the girl she used to be. "Why can't you give me peace? Just tell me what you want," she cried out into the darkness. As she looked at the doll, its eyeless face seemed to shift slightly, as if responding to her anguish in ways that were both comforting and haunting. An unholy understanding lingered in the air, a cruel twist of fate that held her captive. Outside, the rain continued to pour, but Clara's reality was beginning to fade away like a mirage. The walls of her room twisted and warped under the weight of her spiraling thoughts. Shadows danced in chaotic patterns, each flicker reminding her of the monsters that lurked in her mind. Clara's fingers traced the doll's smooth surface, searching for solace amid the storm brewing within her. The faint echoes of her family's voices drifted from downstairs, mere phantoms fading quickly into the abyss of her muddled thoughts. In that tumultuous moment, as the storm roared like a wild beast outside, Clara's heart thudded within her chest, each beat resembling the sound of a war drum. The room pulsed with energy, and with every strike of lightning, shadows lengthened, stretching and murmuring in the dark corners of her mind. Clara felt something shift, a sensation crawling up her spine that sent a wave of absolute dread flooding her body. Suddenly, she awoke, feeling a cold touch brush against her cheek. Startled, she gasped and turned, eyes wide with fear. To her horror, she saw the doll grinning back at her. The dim light caught its contours, making it appear more defined, more alive. It was as if the doll had absorbed every ounce of her despair and was now feeding back the reflection of her own eyeless gaze. Every shred of warmth had fled, leaving only a chilling void. Panic surged through Clara, and she ran to the window, screaming for help that never came. Outside, the storm had grown wilder, and dark shadows twisted in the wind, howling at her anguish. She spun around to face the doll once more, and for the first time, she understood the sinister truth that had been hiding in the depths of her mind. The doll did not seek her fear. It craved all that she was, her dreams, her laughter, and ultimately her soul. Despair crashed over Clara, heavier than the weight of the endless storm outside. If she didn't find a way to break free, the doll would consume her entire being, leaving nothing but echoes of her once bright spirit. Clara's mind raced as she stood there, teetering on the edge of fear and determination. The storm outside raged on, mirroring the tempest in her heart, and Clara knew she had to fight back against the creeping darkness. With steely resolve igniting within her, Clara took a deep breath. She gripped the doll tightly and spoke clearly this time. "You may have taken my fears, but I will not let you take me. I am stronger than you think." The words poured from her heart, fueled by a newfound courage that sparked like a flame in the shadows. The doll surprisingly stilled at her command. For the first time, it seemed to lose its hold on her, the twisted grin faltering momentarily. With that spark of bravery, Clara realized then that her true power lay not in the doll, but within herself. The storm outside did not dictate her fate, instead, she had the strength to reshape her own reality. With her heart racing wildly, she walked toward the doll, ready to reclaim the light that had flickered inside her for far too long. It was time to take back what was hers and to confront the darkness with all the light she could muster. As thunder continued to rumble and rain lashed fiercely against the windows, Clara stood tall, ready to face the unimaginable. As Clara's descent into despair continued, she felt shackled by the chains that the doll had forged around her heart and mind. Each night bled into the next, consumed by the echoes of her fears and the cold grip of the doll that haunted her very being. Clara could hardly recognize the reflection staring back at her in the mirror. She had become pale, with dark circles under her eyes, as if she were a ghost trailing through the shadows of her room. Her once vibrant spirit felt dark and heavy, like a storm cloud hovering ominously over her. It all seemed to change so fast. Days passed, but they were filled with a lingering sense of dread and sadness. Sometimes, as she lay in bed, Clara could feel the doll's presence even when it was not right beside her. It was as if it had woven itself into the fabric of her thoughts, whispering to her in a voice that echoed like a distant thunder. When she glanced over her shoulder, shadows danced menacingly, reminding her of the power the doll held. It was no longer just an old toy. It had transformed into something dark and twisted, feeding on her fears and worries, leaving her feeling hollow inside. Then came the fateful night, a night that would alter everything. The storm outside raged fiercely with a fury unlike any Clara had ever seen. The wind howled as if it were a pack of wolves, each gust tearing through the trees outside. Thunder cracked loudly, breaking the silence like bones shattering, and flashes of lightning illuminated the swirling darkness beyond her window. Clara lay in bed, trembling under her blankets, feeling as if the weight of the world, represented by the doll, pressed down on her chest like a heavy stone. "I can't let this go on," Clara whispered to herself, though she knew it was easier said than done. The shadows whispered to her, twisting her thoughts, saying things like, "You'll never escape it." But deep inside, a flicker of defiance sparked in her heart. "I will end this," she declared into the suffocating darkness of her room. Summoning all her courage, Clara picked up the doll, clutching it tightly as if it were a lifeline in the stormy sea of her despair. She marched to the garden, where the wind twisted the air above, creating a whirlpool of power and chaos around her. The voices that once had soothed her like a gentle lullaby now shouted like angry spirits, furious at her decision to defy them. As Clara stepped outside into the rain, drops hit her skin like icy needles. With the storm raging around her, Clara held the doll high above her head. "You will not control my life any longer," she cried, her voice almost lost in the chaos of the storm. The wind howled back, swirling around her, trying to knock her off balance. The thunder rumbled ominously, like deep laughter coming from the sky. Then, as Clara swung to throw the doll as far away as possible, an unsettling chill clamped down on her wrist, stiffening her arm. Time seemed to freeze, just for a moment. The doll felt heavy in her hand, and its eyeless face stared up at her, reflecting her own terrified gaze. Clara felt as though the very earth beneath her feet had turned slippery and treacherous, as if she stood on the edge of a great abyss, a hungry maw waiting to swallow her whole. Heart racing, she took a deep breath and brought the doll closer. Its malevolent energy crept into her soul like shadows curling around a flickering flame. The world warped around her, shadows lengthening and pooling into grotesque shapes, forming a cage of despair that seemed to close in on her. Clara could feel herself slipping, as if a great weight was pulling her down, threatening to drag her into darkness. "Let it take you," the whispers urged, echoing from the doll, each word slithering into her mind. "Join us in freedom." With each word, Clara's heart twisted painfully. The doll seemed to almost purr with a dark delight as her grip on it weakened. There was a shameful comfort in the dark offer, which almost made her want to give in completely. She could imagine herself floating away, lost in a void where pain no longer existed, where no one could hurt her. But at that moment, Clara remembered the laughter of her friends, the warmth of the sun on her face, and the smell of flowers in the garden. A flickering image of joy ignited inside her and clashed violently against the darkness, filling her with a sudden burst of determination. She shook her head and tightened her grip on the doll once more, fighting against the pull of despair that wanted to swallow her whole. "No," Clara shouted against the raging storm. "You will not win." The wind seemed to respond with a furious roar, but Clara stood tall and firm. "I am stronger than you," she declared defiantly. She mustered every bit of her strength, feeling her heartbeat quicken with the fire of resolve igniting inside her. She lifted the doll high once more, ready to cast it away, ready to reclaim her life from the malevolent embrace that had held her captive for far too long. With a mighty swing, she hurled the doll away from her, watching it spin through the air. But just as it seemed to be flying free, the chill around her wrist tightened again, and Clara found herself yanked forward, stumbling off balance. Her heart raced in fear as the doll hit the ground and landed softly, as if it had a mind of its own. For a moment, Clara stood frozen, watching in disbelief as the doll gradually righted itself, sitting upright and defiant against the storm. The storm seemed to pause for breath, shadows gathering like watching eyes. Clara could feel the weight of all its hatred aimed squarely at her. The winds fell silent, and for a heartbeat, everything was still. Then the voices echoed louder than ever, swirling in her mind with temptation and despair. "Join us, let go of your pain." But Clara steeled herself. "No," she cried louder than before, her voice cutting through the darkness as if it were a sharp blade. She refused to let the darkness take her. "This ends tonight." Slowly, she dropped to her knees, staring intently into the doll's eyeless face, determination coursing through her veins like lightning. "I may have been lost, but I am not broken," Clara shouted, her words resonating through the night. "You cannot have me." The storm around her seemed to roar in anger, but Clara would not be swayed. She gripped the ground, feeling the earth beneath her reach out in solidarity. With every ounce of strength left within her, Clara raised her hands and summoned all the light she could find in her heart, every happy thought, every moment of laughter, every brush with joy. Sparkles of light began to glow around her, shimmering in hues of blue and golden yellow, contrasting forcefully against the darkness. Just then, a brilliant flash of lightning split the sky, striking the ground nearby. The power surged around her, mixing with her own inner light. Clara turned and faced the doll once more, its malevolence momentarily disrupted by the radiance pulsing from her heart. In that moment of clarity, she understood the truth of her fate. The doll could not contain her. She was more than just the sorrow it fed upon. With a surge of courage, Clara spoke from the depths of her being, each word carrying a defiance learned through suffering. "You are nothing without my fear. You are just a doll." The energy around her brightened, a blinding glow that illuminated the dark night. Then, with one final burst of strength, Clara embraced the light fully, filling every corner of her mind and heart with it. The doll vibrated violently in response, the evil force within it faltering as if threatened by the brightness enveloping Clara. Bit by bit, the shadows around her began to dissolve, breaking apart like mist in the morning sun. And even though the storm raged on, inside Clara, a calm descended. Light and warmth surged through her veins, wrapping her in a protective cocoon. She could feel the whispers fading, unable to compete against the power of hope and the love she held for herself. With one last triumphant gaze, she looked at the doll one final time, knowing it no longer had power over her. She had won. It had no hold over her spirit. And as dawn broke, washing the world in soft light, the storm began to retreat, its power crushed under the weight of Clara's conviction. In the end, Clara's laughter rang through the air like a melody of victory. The darkness dissipated, retreating from her heart, leaving behind only whispers of what once was. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Clara took a deep breath, no longer weighed down by the doll's dark influence, finally free to embrace the brightness and wonder of a new beginning. And in her now empty room, the doll lay still upon the ground, its eyeless sockets duller than before, stripped of all the power it once had held over her. As Clara turned away, a sense of peace filled the space where the darkness had once reigned, the first rays of morning illuminating a path toward hope and healing.